Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. As I was growing up in the US, I personally didn't know that many people who were familiar with the British TV show entitled Doctor Who, which at the time was only being shown on some local PBS TV stations. And in spite of the show's all-too-obvious low budget, the time-traveling sci-fi series featured multiple actors portraying multiple incarnations of the show's titular character, who is an alien known as a Time Lord from the planet of Gallifrey, with the ability to regenerate and has a time-traveling spaceship called the TARDIS that's in the shape of a blue British police box. Stories presented in the show were typically subdivided into multi-episode arcs due to the show's 30-minute episode format during its original incarnation. The stories, which were generally well-written and compelling, typically involved the Doctor and his various companions that traveled with him becoming involved in some kind of conflict that would sometimes involve a recurring set of enemies: the Time Lord known as the Master, the destructive artificially created race known as the Daleks, or the cyborg-like race known as the Cybermen. But before proceeding, I'd like to ask everyone to please like this video, please subscribe to this channel, and please press the bell to receive notifications. Thanks! The original incarnation of Doctor Who was produced by the BBC for 26 years, from 1963 to 1989, and was only shown in the US on various local PBS channels, depending upon whether there were enough individuals donating a sufficient amount of money for the series to be shown in their locales. The BBC then resurrected the show in 2005 with hour-long episodes and with Russell T Davies as the show's first showrunner. Under its new incarnation, the show had significantly higher production budgets, which allowed for much better production values and special effects than the original series could ever have dreamed of having. But most importantly, the BBC and Davies, at least at the onset, maintained the intent of the original Doctor Who series, which allowed it to garner a large audience and become hugely popular on both sides of the Atlantic. But many years and several Doctors into the revived series, the show's success began to fade due in large part to the introduction of woke identity politics after Chris Chibnall took over as showrunner in 2017, mirroring what had already been starting to occur in Hollywood, to include gender swapping the show's titular character for the first time with British actress Jodie Whittaker. And while I and probably most viewers did not object with the Doctor being portrayed as a woman for the first time in the show's long history, its once interesting and compelling stories started to become preachy as woke identity politics messaging took precedence over good storytelling, just as that was also occurring throughout Hollywood. Then, with the show's viewership already in decline, Chibnall did the worst possible thing that could have been done to Doctor Who when he took it upon himself to retcon the history of the original 1963 Doctor by declaring that he wasn't from Gallifrey, but was instead some other type of alien that could endlessly regenerate in what is likely the worst ever Doctor Who episode of all time, that's entitled The Timeless Children, which premiered on March 1st, 2020, and was the 12th season's final episode of the revived series. Now, while US viewers could simply walk away and stop watching the series, British viewers who had stopped watching were still forced to help pay for the show's production costs, thanks to Britain's long-standing so-called television tax. That's very difficult to opt out of and can result in fines and even prison time for people who fail to pay. But a short-lived glimmer of hope then emerged when it was announced in 2021 that Chris Chibnall and Jodie Whittaker were leaving the series, and that Russell T Davies was going to return as showrunner, as I had talked about in one of my earliest videos way back in July of 2021. Months later, when Russell T Davies announced in May of 2022 that Black gay actor Ncuti Gatwa was going to be taking over the iconic titular role of Doctor Who, I was cautiously optimistic because at the time I didn't think that the show could become worse than it already had been under Chibnall with Jodie Whittaker, as I had talked about in another video that I had released around that time. And at this point, I need to share what Gatwa said in an interview in May of 2022 as published in The Hollywood Reporter. Quote, "There aren't quite the words to describe how I'm feeling. A mix of deeply honored beyond excited and of course a little bit scared. This role and show means so much to so many around the world, including myself, and each one of my incredibly talented predecessors has handled that unique responsibility and privilege with the utmost care. I will endeavor my utmost to do the same. Russell T Davies is almost as iconic as the Doctor himself, and being able to work with him is a dream come true. His writing is dynamic, exciting, incredibly intelligent, and fizzing with danger. An actor's metaphorical playground. The entire team has been so welcoming and truly give their hearts to the show. And so, as much as it's daunting, I'm aware I'm joining a really supportive family. Unlike the Doctor, I may only have one heart, but I am giving it all to this show." Unquote. So yeah, because of what Gatwa said at the time, I was initially cautiously optimistic. But I'm not optimistic today given that his initial goodwill and praise for those who came before him has been completely replaced with derisive comments, as reported by Variety a few days ago on April 22nd in an article entitled "Doctor Who star Ncuti Gatwa says white mediocrity gets celebrated while black people have to be absolutely flawless to get half that praise." Doctor Who and sex education star Ncuti Gatwa said in a recent interview with the LGBTQ British magazine called Attitude that black people have a pressure to be excellent that is disproportionate to white people, be it in Hollywood or other professions. Well, in 2 years, I guess he's become an expert in everything now. The 31-year-old actor has noticed white mediocrity being celebrated, which is a luxury that does not exist for black people, since they must be absolutely flawless to even get a sliver of attention. Because, you know, the victimhood mentality must always be maintained. Quote, "We're trained to be like, if I'm not exceptional, I won't be loved. Certainly, I think that was my thing," unquote, Gatwa said. Quote, "So yeah, I think I'm just learning now, like, you are allowed to be loved. You don't have to be excellent or aspire to that term, black excellence. What the hell?" Unquote. I'm going to interject that prior to reading this article, I had never heard of the terms white mediocrity or black excellence before. And I strongly believe that no white person would have created either of these racially charged terms. But let's take a moment to look at that article from Attitude magazine about Ncuti Gatwa. Emblazoned at the top of the article is a very large topless picture of the actor. Then when we scroll down a bit, we see the magazine's front cover, which I'd have to say lives up to the magazine's name. And when we scroll a bit further down, we find this rather interesting raised leg pose that could be at least somewhat representative of what the future of the Doctor Who series may be with him. So you might want to keep this particular image in mind as we continue. Going back to the Variety article, quote, "There's so much white mediocrity that gets celebrated, and black people, we have to be absolutely flawless to get half of that anyway," unquote, Gatwa continued. Quote, "So I'm slowly training myself out of that and being like, no shit, you deserve love just for existing. And that has taught me to be a lot more loving as well in a weird way," unquote. While I'm not going to speculate about what he may have meant by that, I'll skip down to these 2 paragraphs from this article. Gatwa revealed last year in a British Vogue interview that he has often had to contend with the industry making generalizations about him due to his appearance and cultural background. And yet, Variety ignores the fact that Gatwa is making broad generalizations about white people and black people. He said that a producer on the first season of Sex Education once approached him with a warning about ad-libbing lines of dialogue in character because the producer was afraid it just wouldn't connect with white viewers. Quote, "There were producers coming up to me like, 'This ad-lib, I don't feel like white people will understand it,'" unquote, Gatwa said. Quote, "And I was like, it's not for white people to understand. There are many white people in this show for white people to understand. But I want this other group of people to understand Eric, and that's what you want too," unquote. So Gatwa was more interested in ad-libbing dialogue that most of the show's viewers might not understand because it wasn't apparently for them. And just like woke identity politics promotes, that's an incredibly tribalistic attitude, and not a particularly welcoming one either, which only drives viewers away. This is one of the reasons why the saying, "go woke, go broke," is accurate. When you have an actor proudly proclaiming that his dialogue isn't meant for a sizable portion of the audience, which is very likely the majority of the audience, then that majority isn't just going to walk away, they're very likely never going to come back. And Ncuti Gatwa sounds like he's very proud of that. Does that make much sense to you? Because it really doesn't make much sense to me. But how does this bode for his upcoming work in Doctor Who as the show's main titular character? Does Gatwa intend to do the same thing as he did in the Sex Education series? That's a legit question. So let's take a look at another Variety article that came out only 3 days after that one, which was on April 25th and is entitled Doctor Who Regenerates, How Ncuti Gatwa's Historic Casting, Russell T Davies' Return, and a Disney Plus deal revolutionized the franchise. Remember how I said that historically, the Doctor Who series has always been funded by the BBC, with British taxpayers bearing the burden? Well, Russell T Davies has indeed revolutionized Doctor Who because it's now also being heavily funded by the Walt Disney Company. Yes, the very same company where Bob Iger is CEO and which has made pushing the woke identity politics message its foremost priority ahead of good storytelling and pretty much everything else. When Ncuti Gatwa makes his first appearance as the 15th Doctor in the science fiction series Doctor Who, he isn't wearing any pants. In a 60th anniversary special released in December, the previous Doctor, played by series icon David Tennant, subverts the show's long-standing practice of regeneration. Instead of simply transforming into the next Doctor, he literally splits in half, bringing Gatwa's Doctor into the world alongside himself. In the process, the two divide the clothes of Tennant's Doctor between them, leaving Gatwa in nothing but a dress shirt and a pair of tighty-whities. Remember what I said earlier about keeping that raised leg image from Attitude magazine in mind? You might want to keep doing that. In addition to the whole no pants thing, Gatwa was just a little bit starstruck. Tennant, who played the part from 2005 to 2010, was the Doctor he'd grown up with, inspiring him to become an actor in the first place. Now, whether that's actually true or not is difficult to say, but it flies in the face of what he said in the article from just 3 days earlier with him talking about white mediocrity, which was 2 years after he praised all of the previous Doctor Who actors who came before him. Quote, "To play this role beside him, who played this role which made me want to do this role, and him also being there, it was just so many layers of full circle," unquote, Gatwa says. Quote, "And on top of it, you're wearing no pants. There was so much going on that day," unquote. No pants would be funny purely as a joke, and I have no problem with there being humor in Doctor Who, but no pants within this context may have other meanings in regards to Gatwa's debut in the series. With Davies back at the helm, Gatwa is making history as the first openly queer black actor to take on the role of the core Doctor. Quote, "Do you know what? It makes perfect sense to me," unquote, Gatwa, who was born in Rwanda and raised in Scotland, says of his casting. Quote, "I feel like anyone that has a problem with someone who's not a straight white man playing this character, you're not really truly a fan of the show. You've not been watching. Because the show is about regeneration and the Doctor is an alien, why would they choose to be this sort of person?" Unquote. Davies echoes that logic. Quote, "They weren't exactly the straightest men in the past," unquote. A trailblazer of LGBTQ television, Davies created the original Queer as Folk in 1999 and 2021's It's a Sin. And about how Gatwa's doctor is different, he says, quote, "You're talking about someone who does have a lightness and a joy about him that, to me, chimes with queer energy. It's very rarely driving the story vehemently, but you will see moments exploring it. We're not delivering a neutered doctor," unquote. I'm going to interject that it's my understanding that an actor's job is to portray a narrative's character as described within that narrative. While different actors have unique sets of experiences, how two different actors may portray the same character is very likely going to have some slight differences between those portrayals. But regardless of the role, actors are supposed to portray the characters as written. They're not supposed to be portraying themselves or their own personal mannerisms and behaviors, because if that's what they're doing, that's not actually acting, now is it? With Gatwa and Davies placing so much importance and emphasis on Gatwa's personality and sexuality, this tends to suggest that the historical nature and behavior of the Doctor may be taking a backseat to Gatwa's own personality. But here's the thing, when audiences tune in to watch an episode of Doctor Who, they want to see the character of the Doctor, regardless of who is portraying the character. Even Jodie Whittaker understood that, but what are viewers going to see when Ncuti Gatwa is portraying Doctor Who? Are we going to see the Doctor, or are we just going to see Ncuti Gatwa playing himself? If the latter is the case, then the forthcoming episodes aren't necessarily going to be Doctor Who. They may instead be the Ncuti Gatwa sci-fi show on race, white mediocrity, and LGBTQ. And I tend to doubt that that's what most viewers are going to be interested in watching. While the Doctor's sexuality has never been labeled, in Gatwa's first episode as the lead, The Church on Ruby Road, which premiered as the traditional Doctor Who Christmas special, viewers saw him dancing in a kilt and referencing his long hot summer with Harry Houdini. And though Davies insists that he didn't set out to be revolutionary in how he cast the next Doctor, saying, quote, "We auditioned men, women, black, white, non-binary actors, and actors whose sexuality was their own private matter," unquote, he also said that these are, quote, "exactly the type of barriers I like to break," unquote. In other words, Davies tacitly admits that he used his own personal biases, which may be very ideological at this point, to cast Gatwa. Quote, "It's very hard for anyone to stop me doing these things," unquote, he continues. Quote, "You'd have to be a pretty brave executive to say, 'Don't go there,' to me. I'm sure there are people thinking that, but I wouldn't work with them, would I?" unquote. Sounds like Davies has quite the chip on his shoulder if you were to ask me. But based on what Davies and Gatwa are now saying, there's clearly going to be a strong bias towards one direction in this show. Davies even goes on to say that as far as he's concerned, he wants to treat this as a brand new show, and that's partially due to the large amount of funding that's now coming from Disney. So this is not a purely BBC production, it's a joint BBC and Disney production. Skipping down to the next highly relevant part of this article, although Gatwa's groundbreaking casting was met with much praise, there were, of course, some haters. Remember, this is coming from Variety, which is not an unbiased publication. Gatwa's message to the naysayers is simple, quote, "Don't watch, turn off the TV, go and touch grass, please, for God's sake," unquote. Whenever a producer or actor tells an audience that if they don't like something to not watch the show, it's pretty much a guarantee that that's exactly what the audience is going to do. But this goes hand in hand with what Gatwa said in that earlier article when he said that he was deliberately ad-libbing dialogue that he assumed a large portion of the audience wouldn't understand because it wasn't for them. Remember when I asked earlier about how that attitude would bode for the upcoming Doctor Who episodes? I think we got the answer to that question. But here's what's truly sad about this. All of this combativeness and negative attitude towards the audience is completely unnecessary. Whereas the humbleness and appreciativeness that Gatwa showed when he was first cast for the role back in May of 2022, as I talked about earlier in the video. Why couldn't Gatwa have simply said something along the lines of, quote, "I hope you'll watch and give my portrayal of the iconic Doctor Who the same opportunity that you have given to past actors when they first started in the role," unquote. But unfortunately, both Gatwa and Davies, like all other woke identity politics activists, appear to be convinced about their own moral and ideological superiority. So for them, it's perfectly okay to be obnoxious and combative towards anyone who doesn't completely fall in line with what they are doing. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.